Won't you be my Valentine? Well, not mine. I mean, I'm married. This is that time when I'll start asking that question. Kids are passing little Valentine's Day cards back and forth to each other. People are panicking over whether or not they remember to get the flowers and the chocolates. Some people even think that this entire holiday is a conspiracy concocted by the greeting card companies. Well, there was a Saint Valentine. Well, there was a Valentine. The problem with Saint Valentine is he doesn't seem to have existed, but there was a very popular early Christian teacher with the same name, whose entire theology was about love and union. But I mean, that couldn't have anything to do with Valentine's Day, could it? So let's talk about what might actually be the true and secret origins of Valentine's Day as we walk together down creation's paths. Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie. I am a Christo-pagan druid and priest of Bridget.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm a Christo-pagan druid and sous chef to the Dagda.
Today, we're going to be talking about who I think Valentine's Day is really in remembrance of, because the historical record is sketchy when it comes to a lot of early Christian saints. There are a lot of early Christian saints that get to have question marks put around them because many of them were local deities or something like that. They got canonized and brought in, and we don't really have historical record for them. Valentine is interesting because the person in history that most aligns with the ideas that we have around Valentine and Valentine's Day was actually declared a heretic shortly after he almost was elected pope, which is just astonishing to think about the turmoil in Christianity at the time. But before we get into all that, if you haven't already, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, whatever the terminology happens to be on whatever app you're listening to us on. We do original Christo-pagan and Druid episodes 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, and you don't want to miss a thing because we've got a lot of fun stuff going on right now. We're currently going through our Druidcraft 101 series, and you don't want to miss any of that. It's going to really be awesome. All right, let's just get into it because I'm excited for this one.
Okay, fellow conspiracy fans, brace yourself. For those that thought that Valentine's was a greeting card conspiracy of capitalism, you're right-ish, but not. It was a Hellenistic plot that got co-opted by a conspiracy of capitalism.
So,
Conspiracies have layers.
I mean, technically, wouldn't it be a Gnostic plot against a Hellenistic plot to shut up a guy that got labeled Gnostic, to
Yeah.
irrelevant and kicked out of the church,
Okay.
that then got co-opted by the greeting card companies to sell stuffed animals and chocolates?
Okay, so everyone's got your corkboard out, right? So we're going to put that pin in the Hellenistic plot, draw our line to the Gnostic conspiracy plot, so we could draw a line to capitalism conspiracy plot. Yeah, Valentine's is like a lovely little layered cake.
So the dates do not line up between the person who is supposed to be Saint Valentine and Valentinus, who is the man that we are going to be talking about today. And I think that's on purpose. I really think that's on purpose, with the church realizing that they could not quell devotion to this man and his teachings and used this to co-opt it. It doesn't help that the church did that a lot, because that makes me feel like, yeah, that's definitely what happened here. Now, I need to say right off the gate, there's no smoking gun for this. There's no like papal document or anything where a whole bunch of bishops were writing to each other saying, hey, here's how we co-opt this movement that was so big and so powerful. It really doesn't get eradicated till the 1500s. Flavors of it keep sprouting up. There's a good chance that the Cathars and the Albigensians were both branches of Valentinian thought. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in here. So who was Valentinus? Well, Valentinus claims to have been the grand disciple of. What I mean by that is he claims that his teacher was a man named Theudas, who was a student of Paul's. So he is just a couple, just basically there's a generation gap between him and the actual apostles. That is his claim. And that what he is teaching is through Christianity. Now, I'm going to say a lot of glowing things about Valentinus, but I want to kind of put this at the front instead of at the end. I do have problems with him. He tended to be an elitist who believed that there was a good kind of Christian and a bad kind of Christian than the pagans and the like, and that people were just naturally born that way. So he does have some really bad colors on him, if you know what I'm saying, that I do not want to gloss over. When you actually look at most of the condemnation that comes down on him, it's often more towards that than his theology. His students tend to get Ptolemy and Heraclitus tend to get much more attacks on them for their theology than Valentinus did. Mostly it was Valentinus saying that he understood what Paul meant by the elect and that he could see the elect and the elect would be sorted out. And yeah, he was one of them. So I don't want you to think everything's roses when it comes to him. I think his theology was problematic. What's interesting is his theology makes Paul make sense because he uses a lot of the same words that Paul does, but actually explains them when Paul never does. You might not realize this if you've only read the New Testament in your native tongue, but Paul is constantly talking about the fullness, the wholeness of God. I've seen it translated several different ways into English. The word that's being covered up there is the Greek word pleroma, which means full. This is an idea that is akin to what we will see later emerge in Orthodoxy and Catholicism with St. Gregory Palamas. This idea that within the Godhead, there are these participatable energies that we can actually be a part of and work in our own lives and be kind of agents of in this world. Like I said, this is a theology that gets much more worked out with St. Gregory Palamas. And we've actually done an episode on him a while back, The Energies of God. So if you looked that one up, we did that a while back, if you want more information about that. And here's the thing, we don't actually know a lot of what Valentinus himself taught. We only have probably one book written by him that has survived virtually intact, and that is the Gospel of Truth. The Gospel of Truth was probably written by Valentinus. We know that that he wrote his own gospel, is usually how it is worded in the condemnations of him. This book is extremely Valentinian in its theology and seems to be old enough and seems to meet a lot of the check marks for what was in this gospel that he wrote. But he also wrote quite a few other books, most of which are gone. They're lost to us, with the exception of, I think, one letter of his survived and a bunch of quotes that people who hated him
Now, on
inserted
that
their
answer,
argument about why he was a bad guy.
the whole gospel critique can be summed up by putting into some context as far as the time frame, maybe. So, like when you're talking about like First, Second Timothy, how recent to his gospel is this? Because we
He
know that if we're talking just two generations after Paul,
I think you
you
could
know,
make a very sound argument that First and Second Timothy, Titus, and Philemon were written specifically to counter Valentinian thought. That they are
because they're
putting words
published
in,
around that same time, aren't they?
yeah, yeah, they're putting words in Paul's mouth to make it look as though he did not believe in any of this spiritual mumbo jumbo, that he did not believe in this cosmic Christ, which again, read Colossians and Ephesians. Paul was all about the cosmic Christ. Valentinus was very clear that Paul did not believe in hell, where the Timothys and the Titus again never explicitly mention hell, but show him very, very worried about the state of people's souls. By the way, if you didn't know this, Paul never mentions hell at all, even in pseudo Paul. That is not a Pauline idea at all. We have no idea what Paul thought about hell. Paul talks
Because
about heaven, but never about hell.
that was some of the context I thought that might help the listeners understand about this critique that he wrote a gospel. Nowadays, to a nowadays listener, that would probably seem very blasphemous or outlandish. I wouldn't agree with the blasphemous statement, but we would see that as a critique of how dare you write a gospel. This is supposed to be like the sacrosanct thing. But he was writing it at the same time. The other books that are actually put into the gospels that are called gospels, somebody wrote Timothy, somebody wrote Philemon, called them, and they got put into the Bible.
I would say that
Valentine wrote a book that was called a gospel, and it didn't. They were all around the same time. So yelling at him for calling it a gospel is not a valid critique.
Well, I would agree that Mark is probably the earliest gospel that we still have. I think there was at least one gospel written prior to that, but it's a theoretical one, the so-called Quella gospel, the source gospel that contained just the sayings of Jesus. I think it probably predated Mark, but Mark was probably the oldest gospel, probably written in the 50s or 60s AD. So within 20, 30 years of Jesus' death. But Mark in its current form didn't exist until the 5th and 6th century. So you have to remember, even these books that we think of as being very old were being edited and revised. For example, the resurrection story that we find in Mark today was not in the original versions of Mark. And in fact, we don't find it showing up in manuscripts until the 4th, 5th, 6th century. So that is being added in after him. So even the gospels that we consider canon were still being edited during this period.
For all you writers out there, if you think your editor's slow, hey, a couple hundred years, they're still faster.
Yeah. I mean, there are
Uh,
passages that are still being added in to what we consider the canonical gospels up to about the 7th, 8th century. Phrases and ideas are being added in and contents are being changed. And we don't want to talk about that. We want to believe that these were just handed down and then meticulously copied. But that is very much not the case. Also, Valentinus's gospel is a very different story. It's more of a commentary. It's a why. It's kind of a, well, why did all these things happen? And it is him laying out his theology in a lot of thick, dense metaphors. Because for Valentinus, much like Paul, which is where I feel like at least a strain of Pauline theology made it into him, he believed that the main idea of Christianity was the marriage between the bride and the bridegroom, between the Christ and his church, which again, we see in the Gospels. So many of Jesus's parables are about waiting for the bridal feast, waiting to enter the bridal feast, make sure you have oil in your lamp so that you don't miss the feast, make sure that you are ready for when the bridegroom comes. Like this is all throughout the Gospels. We also see this language all throughout Paul. And this idea of sacred union is just vitally important to him. Now, where he goes in a direction that most Orthodox Christians would feel strange is he believed that our guardian angel was actually an emanation of Christ. For each person, when they're born, kind of a little piece of Christ reaches out towards them and is their guardian angel. And that it is our purpose and our salvation to live in perfect union. That is the groom to which we are the bride. And so that we are trying to align ourselves with this divine, what we would be if we were perfect. This is core of Valentinian thought. And so when we get to his disciples, and again, we don't know how much of this was his disciples and how much of it was him, but Ptolemy and Heraclitus tell us of this grand story of creation, which starts with God being actually two energies. We have the depth and thought, and then it breaks down and breaks down and breaks down. And I'm not going to go through all of the pairs because there's, I think, 30 of them in total, if I'm remembering my math, because there's there's the 8, the 10, and the 12. So yeah, 30 that make up this kind of ladder down. And we know that this idea is old, by the way, because it is mentioned in First Peter of there are these schools that are going on with their endless genealogies of God. So we know that these ideas are old enough for the writer of First Peter. Again, probably a late first century, early second century document, that these ideas were there in that earliest church. And we see versions of this arise in the Sethians and the Cainites, and the Ebionites kind of had a version of this. Most of the so-called Gnostic groups would have a version of this. Valentinus, at least in what we know of him, had a very simple version of this. It may have been more complex. It's hard to tell, like that of his students. It's hard to know what they innovated on and what they were just reporting from him directly. But it was all about these unions and understanding things in pairs, of never having in your mind that something was just one thing, that everything existed in these ecstatic unions. So what was sin? What was the fall? How do we explain why we're in a world that lacks perfection? Because wisdom decided to just go off and learn stuff and then got lost. And so here we are trying to find our way back, just like she had to find her way back. And when she crossed the veil, when she passed out of the realm of the divine fullness, her name changes and she forgets who she was. Like when we're born, we take on a new name and we forget who we were. And we have to remember our connection to the divine. We have to remember who we were and what we are meant to be and how we interconnect and interrelate with all things. Are you starting to see how this is Valentine's Day? Everything's about this mystical union. Like his entire theology is about this mystical union. And their metaphor for the life of Christ and his crucifixion is this union. In fact, in the Gospel of Truth, he says that Christ was nailed on the cross as an edict. Like the crucifixion isn't this sacrifice to an angry God. It's the world could not accept the message. And so the message was nailed to the cross for everyone to see and read. And for those who have eyes, they can look up and see all of these unions of opposites. Because here is life dying, later to be born again, right? Here is God suffering. Here is someone who is both man and God. Here's somebody who's both alive and dead. Here's somebody who is the quintessential element of faith, right? You don't get much more like core to the idea of faith than a God man crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is Jesus here in between all of the pairs of opposites, showing them in this mystical union, and that is the power of the cross. And to him, this is why Paul says, I preach nothing but the cross. I preach nothing but Christ and him crucified. Like, this is why Paul says that, because it's in this moment we see all of this is a man who has been wrongly convicted and wrongly accused and sent to death, saying, my Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. All of the opposites, all of these pairs are all here in this one divine moment. And it shows us how to see beyond these pairs and to see them in this mystical union. Are we seeing Valentine's Day yet? There's this constant return to these lovers that are yearning for each other and wanting to be locked together in this divine sacred union. And like I said, Valentinianism continues in various forms. We watch it grow and mutate and change, and it really doesn't go away until very late in history. We still see echoes of it up through the early Renaissance. And I would argue that it is still practiced today because we know about the relationship between the Cathars and the Jews in what is now France and Spain, and how they each sheltered one another because of the persecutions that were going on and the allyship that was there and this cross-cultural pollination that was happening between them. So a lot of Cathar prayers read like Jewish prayers, and we see a lot of Cathar theology in this nascent Kabbalistic movement that was coming up. And we see those Christians that survived those persecutions taking a version of that nascent Kabbalah and turning it into the Hermetic Kabbalah that would follow, while the other strain continues off, becomes the Jewish Kabbalah. We can see this union there, and that is this kind of furtherance of these Valentinian ideas, because you see them in the tree. The tree expands it even more, right? Instead of just pairs, we now have threes, because there's not just the two columns, there's this third middle column of equilibrium between them, which is an idea that would come about much later. But even that list, we have the 10. We have the 10, which, by the way, is the heart of God. This is the knowable God, or the 10. You remember when I was saying there's the 8 figures, the 10 figures, and the 12? The 12 is basically all of the energies here on earth. For anybody who practices Kabbalah, these would be all of the energies within Malkuth. But the 10 is that interface between our world and the divine world. And you can see these very stark parallels between the 10 that are named there and the 10 Sephira that you have in Judaism. And again, it's this cross-pollinating that happened in France and in Spain, as these two groups that were under heavy persecution were trying to help each other out and giving shelter to each other throughout this time. So in a lot of ways, Valentinianism didn't die out. We just call its great-great-grandchild Hermetic Kabbalah.
A lot of the ideas and teachings are still very prevalent today, nowadays. You could just look back a couple episodes before when we were talking about both and.
Yeah.
That both and is very much that looking at the union between two things and getting that understanding, finding wisdom in that through that union.
Yeah, Valentinus is a very interesting figure in church history because he's around at this time where we have all of this turmoil happening in the church and is one of the casualties of the Augustinian takeover. Now, Augustine himself, to my knowledge, never wrote anything specifically against him. I think he was much more worried about Pelagius, but we do see Tertullian and others writing about him, and we see a lot of the later writers writing about him too. But you look at what the so-called Pelagian heresy and what Valentinus did, and even the Nestorian heresy, which we've never really talked about, which is an argument over the nature of Jesus's divinity, which we will get into in a future episode because I really want to talk about Taoist Christianity. And I mean ancient Taoist Christianity because it was a thing and we have their writings. And I do want to do that in a future episode. But that came from the Nestorian church. But all of these ideas are looking at a world without original sin. They're all looking at a world where the world itself is a blessing and are trying to figure out and find our way into the world. Now, Valentinus gets into a very strange place because he is very Neoplatonic in a lot of his thoughts and in a lot of his ideas. And I think that's where he goes wrong because, as we know, the church will side with Aristotle over both Plotinus and Plato. Like that's eventually where the church is going, is in the direction of Aristotle. And those two guys disagreed on a lot. And so we have one of the few fragments we have, and it's just to show, because the writer who preserved it was trying to show how ridiculous Valentinus's theology was, is it's a meditation on what happened to the food that Jesus ate. It's a silly question, right? What happened to the food that Jesus ate? Well, Jesus ate it, went into his stomach, and we know what happens after that, right? Here's Valentinus thinking, well, if Jesus is God and human stomachs corrupt the food, so would food corrupt in Jesus' stomach? And it's this prolonged meditation that, like, I can understand where he got there, but it's giving me very like college kid trying to understand the universe energy.
That should make imagining. This is like one of those conversations, a bunch of college kids sitting around stoned with a candle going, and someone goes, "Whoa, I had a deep thought," like
Yeah. Because I mean, when
which
you're sitting back thinking about it, right? Well, if Jesus is God and we have passages of Jesus eating fish and bread and whatnot, well, what happens when God eats something? Does it decompose? Does it go through the natural process? And you can see where that question arises, especially during this time period where, remember, everyone is arguing over what kind of divine is Jesus. Is he divine at
yeah.
all? The Nestorians would say that he is not divine at all. He's just kind of a super prophet. In Nestorian theology, he kind of plays the same role that Elijah plays in a lot of Jewish thought, especially the more mystical thought where he is elevated to the state of Metatron. My problem with that, it being one of the few texts we have, is one, we have no proof he actually wrote it. All we have is somebody who hated him
Yeah.
saying that this
I
is a
mean,
thing that he wrote. That's number one.
yeah.
Number two, we have it completely out of context. For all we know, some kid wrote him a letter. Because the few things that we do have from Valentinus and his disciples are them responding to letters. Famously, Ptolemy's letter to Flora, which really lays out their theology. Some kid could have been like, okay, so we're studying this whole Jesus is God thing, and I got a question, right? We don't know what that preamble was.
And to your
What they
point, it could have been like he could have just been like you said, responding to that and just going, "These are nice thoughts, but they don't really, in the grand scheme of things, how much does that really matter?"
we don't know what
You
came
know?
before or after this. And
Yeah,
this is the
because
problem with
that
a
could have been
lot
the punchline.
And this is the problem with a lot of these teachers that are only preserved through those who viewed them as heretics, as people who were wrong. They're going to pick only the passages that are easy to debunk. Assuming he did write this passage about Jesus' digestion, right? Saying he did write it, this is the easiest thing to critique because you can attack this from so many different angles and in so many different ways. It's just perfect for a also, we don't know if he actually wrote it because it is the perfect way to make fun of, because they were arguing over the materiality of Jesus. This is one of the other challenges that is brought about against Valentinus is that he did not believe that Jesus manifested in flesh, which I think is hard to argue from the Gospels, which he does a lot. Valentinus argues from the Gospels and from Paul a lot. And even Paul talks about people touching him, and you can't touch an immaterial thing. So if I don't fully believe that he he believed that Jesus was just like a ghost walking through the land that allowed himself to look like he got crucified and then what have you.
And that's the thing too, is we try to teach people to watch out for the tools of the principalities and powers
Yeah.
of imperialism. They love to try to pull out ridiculous examples, generally out of context, that could easily be argued and distracted with. So that some people get caught up in the argumentation, some people get just generally distracted by, and then they can just look at it and go, see, wrong, and then try to declare everything wrong.
And I think Valentinus and his disciples are very interesting. Like the entire Valentinian thought process is interesting. I have personally adopted his understanding of the pleroma in many ways, not in totality, but I love this idea of the fullness of God. You've probably heard me on this podcast talk about the fullness of God before. That is directly from Valentinus' idea of these energies that we can participate with, that we have access to. I think it's a really interesting way to conceive of the divine. And as I've become more animistic over time, really lays a good foundation for how I can still understand what's in scripture as it relates to this idea of these various aspects within the fullness of God and not a manifestation of God in total.
And ties in very well to next Tuesday's episode on as we get it further into our Druidcraft series, when we talk about animism.
Because I love talking about animism. So I personally believe that Valentine's Day is a folk holiday because he was very popular on the Italian peninsula. He was very popular throughout Europe. And like I said, we have very little historical record that the Valentine that the story is supposed to be about really existed. And my personal belief, and that's all this is a personal belief that this folk memory of Valentinus, Valentine, gets preserved and becomes misremembered as this romantic holiday of somebody who was performing secret weddings. Because remember, the two main services that were done in the Valentinian church, there was the baptism, and then when their version of confirmation was a marriage ceremony where you married your higher self. And their version of the Eucharist was called the banquet of the bridegroom. So this marriage language was all throughout their theology. In fact, the Gospel of Philip is in this Valentinian school. If you've ever read the Gospel of Philip, another reason they probably were not very popular. This is the Jesus kissed her on the mouth gospel. It's what most people know the Gospel of Philip from in the Mary Magdalene controversies. But there's a very romantic language in a lot of Valentinus's thought, and that gets repackaged and reshaped and reified into this Saint Valentine that we have today. So if you're interested in learning more, there are some interesting books out there, but I would say read the Gospel of Truth. Read it for yourself. The reason for that is if that doesn't make you scratch your head and go, what is this gobbledygook? Then this is something that you will find interesting to be able to get into because it's very dense symbolism and very dense metaphor. And that's all of Valentinian theology is this very dense layer on layer on layer of metaphor. And you can find copies of the Gospel of Truth free online. The Gnostic Society has a pretty good translation of it up on their site that you can read for free. I actually think they have a couple versions of it. They have an entire Valentinus section where you can read a lot of the writings that have survived there, including the Letter to Flora. But I would start with the Gospel of Truth. It's my favorite book in this primary source catalog. And it's one of the best primary sources we have because it was found at Nag Hammadi. And so we actually have a version of it. It's not preserved only in people who did not like him. But I read the Gospel of Truth every year in Holy Week. It's that important to me. And I think it's a good place to start. If that level of dense theological metaphor does not put you off, look more into Valentinus and see if there's other things there, other gems there that you might want to bring into your life. Because I think he's a really interesting dude. And I think that we are actually celebrating him during this holiday. All right. I hope that this has meant something to you. I've been very excited to do this episode for a while because if you can't tell, he is one of my favorite heretics. Someone that I think that said some interesting things. Actually, there's one book recommendation that I will give you. If you really want to see the relationship between Valentinian thought and Paul's thought, Elaine Pagels wrote a wonderful, very short book called The Gnostic Paul. That is all of the writings of Paul footnoted with how it connects to primarily Valentinian, but other so-called Gnostic teachers, but primarily Valentinian thought. And it is a fascinating read because some of those passages that you read and you're like, what in the world is Paul talking about? With a Valentinian context behind it is, oh, that's what he's talking about there. So that is the one book recommendation that I would give because I think it's a really, really interesting book. All right.
Happy Valentinus Day, everybody.
Happy Valentine's Day. All right. I'd love to know what you think about this. Have you heard about Valentinus before? What are your thoughts about St. Valentine? Am I completely off my rocker here? Is the tinfoil hat just a little too crinkly on this one? I try not to get the tinfoil hat out too much, but this one is just it makes so much sense to me that I don't know. It works. So let me know what you think in the comments. If you're listening to us on YouTube or Spotify, you can leave a comment right there. If you're listening to us anywhere else, even if they say you can leave a comment, they won't let us know. So leave a comment there anyway, because engagement is magic. And then head over to creationpath.com, click on chat, and you can leave a comment there and let us know what you think about all this, because I'm really curious for the comments on this one. I have not been feeling well, and I am trying to get through the comments as fast as I can, but I do love seeing them. Trust me, we read them. It just takes me a while to have the energy to formulate responses sometimes, because sometimes I'm just like, yeah. And sometimes I want to really put a response in. So thank you for your patience on that. While you're over at Creations Pass, if you have a few dollars you can pass our way, you can join. We have either a monthly or an annual membership that we offer over there. You can also support us on Patreon or Ko-fi. I am C. Dorset on both. We also have a Cash App cash tag. We are cash tag Creations Pass, where you can give donations directly. And thank you to everybody who does that. You really do help us keep the lights on, keep food on our table, and a roof over our heads. You all are amazing. And thank you so very much. If you don't have any money right now, or you don't know or you don't know that we're the kind of people that you want to give your hard-earned treasure to, that's perfectly all right. But if any of the episodes we've done have helped you out, please share them with others. That helps us out more than you know. And as we are heading out, I think a lot of people are going to think I'm going to pray to St. Valentinus, but I'm not. I'm going to pray to our Blessed Mother Sophia, the divine wisdom, the Chokhmah, the one who has been there in the beginning, playing before God. Help to enlighten us and open our minds so that we may find the truths wherever we can, and to continue to seek out wisdom throughout this world. Amen.
Amen.